Sara Ahmed, living a feminist life. To the many feminist killjoys out there doing your thing, this one is for you. Conclusion 2. A Killjoy Manifesto. A manifesto. A statement of principle. A mission statement. Manifesto. A declaration of the intent of an individual or organization or group. How can one write a manifesto around a figure, the killjoy, or an activity, killing joy? A manifesto, to make manifest. Moynihan King, in her discussion of 𝘈 𝘒𝘪𝘧𝘦𝘴𝑗 Scum Manifesto, addresses the sense of a manifesto as making manifest. She writes, as a manifesto, Scum's intention is to make manifest, to render perceptible a new order of ideas. To render a new order of ideas perceptible is simultaneously a disordering of ideas. Manifestos often enact what they call for in surprising and shocking ways, given how they expose the violence of an order. A feminist manifesto exposes the violence of a patriarchal order, the violence of what I call in Chapter 2, the machinery of gender. A manifesto not only causes a disturbance, it aims to cause this disturbance. To make something manifest can be enough to cause a disturbance. This intimacy between manifestation and disturbance has implications for how we write a Killjoy manifesto. A Killjoy manifesto must be grounded in an account of what exists. Why is this important? It is about what we come up against. Some of the worst abuses of power I have encountered in the academy have been when individuals make use of an equality principle, as if to say, boundaries and rules are about the hierarchy, so we are free to do what we want, whereby free to do what we want really still means you doing what I want you to do, given that the we is made up of an I who has power and a you that is subordinate by virtue of their positions within an organization. Note that doing what we want not only can be assumed to express an equality principle, but can be articulated as a rebellion against institutional norms and authority. They would prevent us from having relationships because they assume boundaries and divisions that we have given up because we are free radicals. A Killjoy manifesto cannot be about the freeing of radicals to pursue their own agendas. A Killjoy manifesto thus begins by recognizing inequalities as existing. This recognition is enacted by the figure of the Killjoy herself. She kills joy because of what she claims exists. She has to keep making the same claim because she keeps countering the claim that what she says exists does not exist. The Killjoy is often assumed to be inventive, to bring about what she claims, or, to use my terms from Chapter 6, she is often assumed to be a wall maker. If a Killjoy manifesto shows how the denial of inequality under the assumption of equality is a technique of power, then the principles articulated in that manifesto cannot be abstracted from statements about what exists. A Killjoy manifesto is thus about making manifest what exists. In the labor of making manifest, we make a manifesto. To struggle for freedom is to struggle against oppression. Angela Davis in Blue Legacies and Black Feminism showed how the articulation of unfulfilled longings for freedom can also represent freedom in more immediate and accessible terms. It is from oppression that freedom is given expression. A manifesto is required when a struggle is necessary to give expression to something. This is why the manifesto can be understood as a Killjoy genre. We have to say it because of what is not being done. A manifesto makes an appeal by not being appealing. A manifesto is not an attractive piece of writing by existing norms or standards. It cannot be. It has to strain to be said. And yet a manifesto is appealing to those who read it. A manifesto appeals for something by appealing to someone. A Killjoy manifesto appeals to killjoys. Manifestos are often disagreeable because they show the violence necessary to sustain an agreement. It is not just that the feminist Killjoy has a manifesto. The feminist Killjoy is a manifesto. She is assembled around violence. How she comes to matter, to mean, is how she exposes violence. Just remember the kill in Killjoy. This figure reminds us how feminism is often understood as a form of murder. Calling for the end of the system that makes men is often understood as killing men. We could indeed compare the figure of the murderous feminist to that of the feminist Killjoy. What 𝘈 𝘒𝘪𝘭𝘫𝘺 does in her manifesto, very controversially, is to literalize that fantasy of the murderous feminist through imagining a feminist collective or a mindset, that is, scum. Society for cutting up men. It should not surprise us, because one of her points was to be a cutoff point, that the Scum Manifesto was read literally. It was dismissed as literal, or dismissed through literalism, as it intending the elimination of men. The manifesto works because it enacts the literalism that would enable its own dismissal. I have noticed this use of literalism as dismissal when working on my Feminist Killjoy blog. For example, when I tweeted a link to a blog post, White Men, which was retweeted by a white man, another white man called it genocide. Genocide, the self-willed killing of a people. Or another time, a student at Goldsmiths, Bahar Mustafa, allegedly used the hashtag #KillAllWhiteMen. 𝘈 𝘒𝘪𝘭𝘫𝘺 is brought back to life on social media. Snap! But of course, if this hashtag literalizes a fantasy, you literally encounter the fantasy. The hashtag is turned back into a command, heard as the planning of genocide. The figure of the murderous feminist is useful. It allows the survival of men to be predicated on the elimination of feminism. Much feminist creativity has literalized a fantasy that does not originate with us, including the film A Question of Silence, discussed in chapters 8 and 9, where the man that is killed in an act of feminist revenge stands in for all men. And in a way, of course, you are being violent in exposing violence. If you are letting the violence come out of your own pen to travel through you, you have to let the violence spill all over the pages. And you are in a certain way calling for the end of white men, because you are calling for the end of the institution that makes white men. White men is an institution, as I discussed in chapter 6. We do want to bring an end to him. But of course, at another level, it is harder to redeploy the figure of the murderous feminist than the figure of the feminist Killjoy. Feminists are not calling for violence. We are calling for an end to the institutions that promote and naturalize violence. Much violence that is promoted by institutions is concealed by the very use of stranger danger, as I have discussed throughout this book. The assumption that violence only ever originates with outsiders. It is because we expose violence that we are heard as violent, as if the violence of which we speak originates with us. To be a killjoy can also mean being understood as someone who kills life, because there is such an intimacy between the life principle and the happiness principle. In being against happiness, you are assumed to be against life, and as such there are life risks in being a killjoy. It is not that in being assigned a killjoy, and as I have argued, she always begins as an assignment because the feminist killjoy is announced from a position of exteriority. She already has a life of her own before we are assigned her. We are always willing or able to receive this assignment. In fact, as I explored in part 1, the figure of the feminist killjoy often comes up in situations of intense pain and difficulty. When you are seated at the table doing the work of family, that happy object, say, you threaten that object. And you threaten the object by pointing out what is already there in the room. Again, you are not being inventive. But what a feeling! When all the negative feeling that is not revealed when the family is working becomes deposited in the one who reveals the family is not working. I will never forget that feeling of wanting to eliminate myself from a situation that I had been assumed to cause. It is a downer. We are downers. A Killjoy manifesto has company. Books that bring things down. Books that enact a collective frown. The Dialectic of Sex could be read as a Killjoy manifesto. A book that has too quickly been dismissed as assuming technology would liberate women from biology. A book that showed that when the sexual division of labor structures everything, nothing will liberate anyone. Sarah Franklin describes how the, and I quote, bulk of Firestone's manifesto was based on an analysis of what has held a certain gender stratification in place for millennia, end of quote. The Dialectic of Sex is optimistic because it accounts for how liberation is difficult to achieve. No wonder she has her Killjoy moments. Firestone wants to explain why the system that is not working keeps on going. A system that she has no doubt eventually will kill us all. And for explanations, she turns to love, to romance, to the family. These institutions are promises of happiness. An institution can be organized around a promise, and they become ways of organizing living by assuming that proximity to a form will get you there. So, of course, Shulamith Firestone, in turning in this direction, turns to happiness. As I have already noted, she describes her dream action for the women's liberation movement as a smile boycott. Perhaps we could call this action, following Lisa Milbank, a smile strike, to emphasize its collective nature. Collectively, we would strike by not smiling, a collectivity built out of an individual action. Not smiling is an action when smiling is a requirement for women and for those understood as serving others through paid or unpaid work, but which requires more than an individual. A smile strike is necessary to announce our disagreement, our unhappiness with a system. We must stay unhappy with this world. The figure of the feminist Killjoy makes sense if we place her in the context of feminist critiques of happiness, some of which I discussed in Chapter 2. Happiness is used to justify social norms as social goods. As Simone de Beauvoir describes so astutely, it is always easy to describe as happy a situation in which one wishes to place others. Not to agree to stay in the place of this wish might be to refuse the happiness that is wished for. To be involved in political activism is thus to be involved in a struggle against happiness. The struggle over happiness provides the horizon in which political claims are made. We inherit this horizon. A Killjoy becomes a manifesto when we are willing to take up this figure, to assemble a life not as her. I discussed the risks of assuming we are her in Chapter 7, but around her, in her company. We are willing to Killjoy because the world that assigns this or that person or group of people as the Killjoys is not a world we want to be a part of. To be willing to Killjoy is to transform a judgment into a project, a manifesto, how a judgment becomes a project. To think of Killjoys as manifestos is to say that a politics of transformation, a politics that intends to cause the end of a system, is not a program of action that can be separated from how we are in the worlds we are in. Feminism is praxis. We enact the world we are aiming for. Nothing less will do. Lesbian feminism, as I noted in Chapter 9, is how we organize our lives in such a way that our relations to each other as women are not mediated through our relations to men. A life becomes an archive of rebellion. This is why a Killjoy manifesto will be personal. Each of us Killjoys will have our own. My manifesto does not suspend my personal story. It is how that story unfolds into action. It is from difficult experiences of being bruised by structures that are not even revealed to others that we gain the energy to rebel. It is from what we come up against that we gain new angles on what we are against. Our bodies become our tools. Our rage becomes sickness. We vomit. We vomit out what we have been asked to take in. Our guts become our feminist friends the more we are sickened. We begin to feel the weight of histories more and more. The more we expose the weight of history, the heavier it becomes. We snap. We snap under the weight. Things break. A manifesto is written out of a feminist snap. A manifesto is feminist snap. And we witness as feminists the trouble feminism causes. I would hazard a guess. Feminist trouble is an extension of gender trouble. To be more specific, feminist trouble is the trouble with women. When we refuse to be women, in the heteropatriarchal sense as being for men, we become trouble. We get into trouble. A killjoy is willing to get into trouble. And this, I think, is what is specific about a Killjoy manifesto, that we bring to our statements of intent or purpose the experience of what we come up against. It is this experience that allows us to articulate a for that carries with it an experience of what we come up against. A for can be how we turn something about. A manifesto is about what it aims to bring about. There is no doubt in my mind that a feminist killjoy is for something, although as killjoys we are not necessarily for the same things. But you would only be willing to live with the consequences of being against what you come up against if you are for something. A life can be a manifesto. When I read some of the books in my survival kit, I hear them as manifestos, as calls to action, as calls to arms. They are books that tremble with life because they show how a life can be rewritten, how we can rewrite a life, letter by letter. A manifesto has a life of its own. A manifesto is an outstretched hand. And if a manifesto is a political action, it depends on how it is received by others. And perhaps a hand can do more when it is not simply received by another hand, when a gesture exceeds the firmness of a handshake. Perhaps more than a hand needs to shake. If a Killjoy manifesto is a handle, it flies out of hand. A manifesto thus repeats something that has already happened. As we know, the Killjoy has flown off. Perhaps a Killjoy manifesto is unhandy, a feminist flight. When we refuse to be the master's tool, we expose the violence of rods, the violences that built the master's dwelling, brick by brick. When we make violence manifest, a violence that is reproduced by not being made manifest, we will be assigned as killjoys. It is because of what she reveals that a killjoy becomes a killjoy in the first place. A manifesto is in some sense behind her. This is not to say that writing a Killjoy manifesto is not also a commitment, that it is not also an idea of how to move forward. A Killjoy has her principles. A Killjoy manifesto shows how we create principles from an experience of what we come up against, from how we live a feminist life. When I say principles here, I do not mean rules of conduct that we must agree to in order to proceed in a common direction. I might say that a feminist life is principled, but feminism often becomes an announcement at the very moment of the refusal to be bound by principle. When I think of feminist principles, I think of principles in the original sense. Principle as a first step, as a commencement, a start of something. A principle can also be what is elemental to craft. Feminist killjoys and other willful subjects are crafty. We are becoming crafty. There are principles in what we craft. How we begin does not determine where we end up, but principles do give shape or direction. Feminist principles are articulated in unfeminist worlds. Living a feminist life with feminist principles is thus not living smoothly. We bump into the world that does not live in accordance with the principles we try to live. For some reason, the principles I articulate here ended up being expressed as statements of will, of what a killjoy is willing to do or to be, or not willing to do or to be. I think we can understand the sum of this reason. A killjoy manifesto is a willful subject. She wills wrongly by what she is willing or is not willing to do. No wonder a willful subject has principles. She can be principled. She can share them, if you can bear them. Principle 1. I am not willing to make happiness my cause. Principle 2. I am willing to cause unhappiness. Principle 3. I am willing to support others who are willing to cause unhappiness. Principle 4. I am not willing to laugh at jokes designed to cause offense. Principle 5. I am not willing to get over histories that are not over. Principle 6. I am not willing to be included if inclusion means being included in a system that is unjust, violent, and unequal. Principle 7. I am willing to live a life that is deemed by others as unhappy, and I am willing to reject or to widen the scripts available for what counts as a good life. Principle 8. I am willing to put the hap back in happiness. Principle 9. I am willing to snap any bonds, however precious, when those bonds are damaging to myself or to others. Principle 10. I am willing to participate in a Killjoy movement.